webinar on the draft procurement regulations. Today I've got our team here. I've got Anton van Geest, technical expert with Diversify. Diversify is our BE and transformation advisory business. I've got Bongi Mtunzi, transformation specialist, also with Diversify, and Chris van Wyk, who's the director of Alternative Prosperity, and Chris heads up our solutions business, Solve SA and Cube. My name is Eric Ackroyd, Chief Operating Officer of Diversify. The format of today's session, we're going to start off with a fireside chat that I think is quite useful, given that it's cold in Cape Town, it's cold in Joburg. We then also just going to run through some slides on the regulations, and we'll end off with a further fireside chat. So welcome, and I hope you're all warm enough and enjoy the session. To kick off, Chris, how did the legislation come about? What led onto it, and what is the legal status of the Act, the Public Procurement Act, and the regulations?
Yeah, thanks, Eric. It's got a long history. One has to zoom out somewhat before you zoom in onto these things. So the overarching mandate for this legislation still resides in Section 217 of the Constitution. And there are three subsections there. The first one is very clear that the general rule of procurement remains to achieve fair, equitable, transparent, and cost effectiveness in the procurement mechanisms. And then rule 2, that organs of state are not prohibited from applying policy to advanced categories of people previously discriminated against, but then the curbing of that again, that should happen within the framework of national legislation that's set. And this is what this Act tries to do. It follows on the Provincial Procurement Framework Act of 2000, that was then revisited in 2020, in 2024 by this new act that we have. And the reason for that is that in 2020, Agribusiness took the Minister of Finance to court. Well, actually in 2020 is when the Constitutional Court made the decision, and particularly with regards to the pre-qualification criteria that the minister tried to introduce in the 2014 regulations for 51% black-owned EMEs, QSEs, those type of vehicles. And the basis of Agribusiness's decision or case was that the minister was acting outside of its powers in terms of the Act, and the Constitutional Court agreed with him. They found that that these regulations that the minister passed, he was not authorized to pass regulations on policy matters, that the then Act actually reserved for organs of state. So they had to revisit the Act itself, which they did in 2024. This is the Public Procurement Act that we now have. And that was gazetted 2024, June 2024, July 2024, and is legislation at the moment. But now there's regulations that needs to be passed in terms of that. Now, just quickly, the legislation itself, the issue of ultra vires or outside of scope was fixed by the new legislation, because they brought set-asides, pre-qualification, subcontracting rules into the main Act itself as mechanisms. So that's not something that the minister has authority over anymore. So that part of it was fixed. But I think the other problem that the legislation has now is it now sets these transformational agendas as it reorders it, so it becomes the priority in the legislation. So organs of state must have policies for set-asides, these things, etc., and then only the evaluation happens. So I still think it'll fall if tested against the Constitutional Court's decision in that case, because the Constitutional Court was quite clear, is that these kind of rules can only exist and not be in contravention of the Constitution if they actually serve the first objective of 217, which is fair, equitable, transparent. And it actually found in that court case that those pre-qualification criteria did not meet the muster, although the case wasn't about that. But it made that call in the thing. So that's where we are at the moment. These regulations are out for draft, and commentary should be in by 15th of June this year on these draft regulations.
Thanks, Chris, for that overview. Bongi, just on the Public Procurement Act, what are the objectives of the Act and who does this apply to?
Thank you, Eric, and thank you everyone for joining us this morning. In terms of the objectives of the Act, basically the objective is to introduce uniform treasury norms and standards. And I think everyone will be aware of, what we've seen in the media lately, the Tembisa issue. So in that kind of a scenario, basically the need is to advance ethical conduct and combat corruption by introducing transparent processes and measures to ensure that there is enforcement and sanction for those that do transgress in terms of the Act. Also, one of the things that is being highlighted today is to highlight transformation and industrialization, and also to expedite dispute resolution. As you can see, there is now the tribunal, formation of a tribunal in terms of Section 36. Also, obviously, to ensure efficient and effective use of, public resources. To your second portion, in terms of the question, this would apply to a number of, national departments that basically apply the PFMA. This is your departments, for example, of agriculture, your departments of basic education. It will also look at, include constitutional bodies, that is your Chapter 9 institutions listed in Schedule 1. For example, your Electoral Commission, your public protectors, your Auditor Generals. Then obviously your municipalities around the country. Then obviously your public entities, especially 2 and Schedule 3 of the PMFA. This is your public entities, your ESCOMs, your access that should also be incorporated in there.
Thanks. Thank you, Bongi, for that. Anton, the Act establishes a Public Procurement Office, which is a new institution. What is the purpose of the Public Procurement Office and what do they do?
Yeah, thanks, Eric. The Public Procurement Office is almost something similar to what we know in the B Commission, if I can simplify it in some way. It must regulate procurement overall. It has the function to promote compliance with the Act and obviously with the regulations as well in terms of that, and also develop necessary measures to maintain integrity of the system. Further, it should provide guidance, development of ICT type of infrastructure, measures to maintain and develop also procurement systems, for instance, and then also very specifically, it can provide some binding instructions in terms of certain procedures, but very interesting, only to, let's say, state-owned enterprises and so on. The interesting fact is that municipalities cannot really be instructed how to conduct their procurement. Very interesting fact, and that's what we're reading in this sometimes, is that a lot of corruption and things happening at municipal level. For the instructions, it can be a binding type of instruction for state enterprises, but for municipalities is non-binding by the Procurement Office. But be as it may, the Public Procurement Officer is there actually to regulate and to oversee the whole function and to ensure that procurement is done according to the legislation.
Thanks, Anton. Chris, Section 17 of the Act deals with set-asides, and the heart of the Act is public, or rather preferential procurement, and advancing transformation through public spending. Who are the specific categories of persons that the set-asides apply to?
Yeah, so I think maybe firstly is the set-asides applies to businesses with or bids that have a turnover threshold below 20 million rand. So the set-asides, the pre-qualifications all have a different kind of threshold. And it applies to categories of people that they list in Section 73, which are Black people, Black women, Black disabled people, and then also women in general, people with disabilities in general, military veterans, and any of those people within a particular geographical area that the procurement institution feels warrant in terms of its policy to advance. And then it goes further and it says, listen, in small enterprise owned by any of those categories of people, a small enterprise in general, so it could theoretically include white-owned small enterprises, co-ops in general, similar story, and co-ops owned by Black people. So what's interesting for us, when we look at this, the minister was actually required to take cognizance of the Broad-Based Black Economic Empowerment Act when coming up with the regulations, but the act itself uses terms that are not aligned with the BEE codes. So, for example, small enterprises, one would think would have been aligned to the EME or QSE kind of definition within the BEE codes, and it's not. The definition actually follows the definition of the Small Enterprises Act, and that in Schedule 1 thereof, there's a list of industries with turnovers and particular number of employees. Just to give you an idea, the majority of those industries fall within the generic scope, their upper thresholds of their turnovers. Similarly, and just using the financial services industry as an example, is 85 million, mining 210 million, manufacturing 170 million, to give you an idea. So what's also important is that the regulations refined what the percentage is that the small enterprises must be owned by these natural people that's linked to them, and it must be 100% owned by Black people, 100% owned by Black women, 100% by disabled people and military veterans, etc., if those categories form part of the policy of that particular thing, and must be 100% owned by citizens. I think there is going to be difficulties with this. Businesses can't grow. Typical businesses, smaller businesses need capital. Part of the avenues of that capital is private equity, venture capital, foreign investment for that matter. All of them are blended or white. So you exclude actually with this rule of 100% Black owned a lot of I don't think it's counterintuitive to transformation. That's the point I want to make. And I would suggest that we reduce that to 51% Black owned or something like that.
So that's something we can put in the commentary
for sure,
as a proposed amendment to the legislation. So
yeah,
we've got the 3 stages. We've got a set aside. We then have pre-qualification, and we have subcontracting, depending on the size of the bids. Bongi, the pre-qualification, how does that work?
Thank you, Eric. This is in terms of Section 18, basically looks at contracts that are above 20 million, but below 100 million in terms of the estimated value of the contract. Basically, here we're looking at bidders that must meet minimum B requirements or target in terms of the spend with suppliers or entities that are owned and managed by Black people. So this basically drills into your preferential procurement performance on your scorecard, where it says at least 40% of your spend should be with 51% Black-owned entities, or you should make that available to by making that available in terms of the 30% subcontracting. So that drills into your scorecard, and that will be a subject of scrutiny in terms of pre-qualification to actually also go into that and identify the specific suppliers that actually make up that 40% in terms of that requirement.
Thanks. Anton, Section 60 of the Act deals with offences. What are the different offences, and what are the potential consequences of these offences?
Eric, the consequences are that it could be up to 10 years of imprisonment or fines, and even the fines are linked to some cost of confiscation of assets, for instance, by the authorities in that regard. But what is an offence in this case? Typically, if you provide false information, misleading information, or if you interfere with or undue influence the tender with some of the officials there, or even with the tribunals. It includes basically also, unauthorized opening of or disclosure of your tender requirements before the bid was now submitted. Corruption, typically fraud, all of that, collusion is also part of the offences, and even for officials and so on, causing loss of public assets through a willful act, for instance, can be seen as one of these offences. Interestingly, there's a more administrative type of offence also for, you know, failing to provide the required information, for instance, that's required. And then unjustified delays in evaluating or awarding the bid. So if there's a delay in the process and it cannot be justified, those carry an offense, you know, penalty of up to 3 years imprisonment, for instance. It very much aligns with what we see on the BEE regulations as well. For us sitting in the BEE side, where there's also these different types of penalties for fronting and other penalties, for instance. But you know, even the penalties is very much the same.
Yeah, Anton, maybe I can just add that I think the important thing is that all of those offences and therefore penalties are in addition to the disbarment process or the debarment process that the legislation actually provides for, because there's a process by which they can exclude the bidding entity and any organisation associated or attached to that entity from actually procuring for a particular period of time. And there's a whole process around that. But yeah, and that happens internally. It can be taken on review to the tribunal that was established, but it doesn't necessarily have to. So this judicial process of this criminal process that you are describing sits over and above this debarment that happens.
Goes outside, because the office, the public procurement office, will have to oversee this process, and then they can take it further.
For sure.
Yeah. Good.
Thank you. So let's go into the presentation on the draft regulations and just talk through a bit of the theory around the regulations. Just a question as to why does this matter? What is the relevance and what is the change? So the first change is that the Preferential Procurement Policy Framework Act of 2000 and the regulations are being replaced by the Public Procurement Act and the regulations. So as Chris mentioned, the regulations are in draft. The Public Procurement Act has been enacted and it is being phased in. And the regulations replace the 80-20 and the 90-10 point system. So with the PPPFA and the regulations, we had 80 points for price and 20 points for BE on smaller contracts, and then 90 for price and 10 for BE levels on the larger contracts. So that is now being replaced by this three-tiered preferential mechanism that is the set-asides, the pre-qualification, and then the mandatory subcontracting. And we also see the requirement of 100% ownership for these designated categories or specific categories that we see. We also have the stronger implementation requirements and also the debarment processes. If we look at the overall structure of the Act, it's made up of different chapters, rather the regulations made up of different chapters. The important chapter for us is the one around preferential procurement, which is chapter 5, which then defines and actually specifies the thresholds for set-asides for pre-qualification and subcontracting. Chapter 6 provides for the implementation of the Public Procurement Office, and then Chapter 7 is around the integrity and the debarment processes. All right, so further determination is with different procurement methods that are specified in the regulations. And the first one is a request for quotation, which is applicable where we've got a standardized service or goods or product. They are low risk, and this requires a written quotation. It is also where the specifications are clear and there's not a requirement for process or specifications to be defined. And the evaluation is mostly on price. So it's primarily dependent on price, the award of the RFQ. The next, we have a request for a bid, which is a publicly advertised tender. The specifications are clear in this case, and it would be evaluated against evaluation criteria with weighted points, and the bid with the highest points gets the award. Then we've got a request for proposal. This is where the specifications aren't all that clear. It's a complex and a specialized area that it covers. And the evaluation criteria is based on weightings against particular criteria. There are also proposed solutions required in the proposal, as well as methodologies. So the subject matter is complex, and there are also proposals of how would we go about to deliver on the request. We then also have a direct procurement. This is where there's only one supplier, there's exclusive or intellectual property, unique expertise, and it is also when it is very specialized in nature. The regulations also provide for framework agreements where there are recurring needs. So a framework agreement would be put in place and call-offs would be made in accordance with the determinations of the framework agreement. And then there's provisions around competitive dialogue where there's an iterative process in order to define technical specifications and the requirements. I'll hand over to Bongi to take us through the next section.
Thank you, Eric. If you can move forward. Okay, thank you. So in terms of what Eric said, we now have the 3-tier preferential procurement system that basically replaces your 80-20 or your 90-10 point system. And I think we've already spoken to the tier 1, which is basically the set aside in terms of section 17. This is for contracts, estimated value of up to 20 million, and with specific reference to 100% ownership by those identified category. And, you know, the procuring entity has to at least have 3 potential, you know, identify 3 potential categorized individuals or requirements in there. So this has to be 100%, and basically the 100% is defined in terms of the codes, which means it has to be 100% African citizens in terms of section 17. You have to, sorry, did you move? Okay, so in terms of that, it's, yes, section 17, and then can you move on to section 18, please? Okay, then this is the pre-qualification that we've already spoken about, which is basically your contracts threshold of between 20 and 100 million per contract. And the procuring entity has to at least have 3 minimum potential qualifying suppliers. And again, this, like indicated before, drills down to the 40% prior procurement spend to enterprises that are at least 51% Black owned or managed by, you know, Black entities. The bidders must also subcontract to 30% and 100% Black owned enterprises or Black majority cooperatives. And there is a need to disclose the subcontractors, the name, and the substitution allowed only with notification, which means you cannot just substitute. You should make a formal application for the substitution of that subcontractor. Then the last criteria, which is the mandatory subcontracting. This is for contracts that are above 100 million. This comes with the requirement that at least 25% of the contract should be subcontracted to, you know, again, an identified category, enterprise or cooperative, and obviously meeting the requirements as required, your Black people, your Black youth, which we normally call Black designated groups within the B legislation. And in terms of eligibility, it's 100% citizen ownership of enterprises. And that again is aligned to the definition in terms of the courts. Once you've identified your subcontractor, again, there is no further subcontracting permitted. In case where the main contractor defaults on any of the requirements, direct payments can still be made to the subcontractors. And there's also a suggestion of an expedited arbitration mechanism within this. Okay. In a scenario where, you know, the 3 tiers have failed, and that is covered in terms of the Regulation 55. This must be reported to the Public Procurement Office. This creates a formal accountability trail, and that application to the PPO must describe the value in terms of the goods and services that were being procured, the value in terms of the unbundled portion and what was intended to be apportioned for set-asides, the reasons why the preference could not be applied, and then also measures taken to comply with the other preference provisions. If no response from the target category, then the procuring entity should submit to the PPO the bid number, the geographical impact, the strategy, the method used, and the complexity of factors faced in terms of trying to advertise that particular bid. Then that once it's submitted to the PPO makes a consolidated annual matrix that should be available publicly to everyone to see. But obviously this then creates the issue to say what happens after the PPO has actually published this national matrix. And I think it's one thing that should definitely be covered in terms of what happens immediately after that is published for everybody to see what has actually failed in terms of that national matrix.
Thanks, Bongi. Yes, taking further on that, and just on that note, very specifically, if there's no responses, for instance, it seems like the procurement officer or procuring party can then decide on how to take it forward. The procurement office is just there for the reporting purposes in this case. So we can discuss it a little bit later, maybe in the next fireside chat again. But other preference measures are also included. This is more on an optional basis by the procuring entity, which may include something like sustainable development requirements, for instance, if you think of renewable energy targets or carbon efficiencies, for instance, labor practices. It might include also beneficiation and innovation type of solutions that might be part of it, local versus imported content, for instance. Also job creation requirements. Further to that, also local development type of SME development type of requirements. All of those might be included also as part of additional preferences, additional requirements to this contract. And yes, this will be monitored and tracked, and there will even be targets when they impose, when these procuring entities impose these type of targets or requirements for such a tender. So it goes even further that there will be penalties if the supplier does not comply with these type of requirements, for instance. Even so much that there's financial penalties, or it could be a cancellation or suspension of the contract, even debarment, for instance, as Chris mentioned earlier. And for that purpose, specifically the financial type of penalties, typical preference performance bond will be required to be registered, linked to a certain value, which will provide security for complying with these requirements. So there are some teeth in terms of these type of preference measures that gets included. Furthermore, there is still a point system here on evaluation criteria, and the typical evaluation criteria does include the likes of cost efficiencies and capability and capacity, functionality, for instance, and technical abilities and so on. Also, your B preference requirements are part of that, and also some local content requirements, all are part of the evaluation criteria. But for the point system, out of 100 points, 70% of the points must be allocated to capability and capacity requirements, to functionalities, and to B preference criteria. And Up to 30% of the points must then be allocated towards price. Very interesting for those 4 criteria. So what we've seen previously with the 80-20 and 90-10 principle, price and content and technical was part of the 80 and the 90, and the BEE requirements were 10 and 20. Now it's flipped around, where up to 30% can constitute price, and your BEE preference requirements are lumped together with some of the other the technical requirements and the capacity and capabilities and things like that. It does require also for procuring entities to do, for the shortlisted bidders, at least some criminal background requirements, ownership verification, financial due diligence, all of that actually. And once you award a contract over 50 million, there must be a briefing session to the public and civil society and so on, to then disclose and provide also some information on to the unsuccessful bidders and around that. So there's some transparency, but you can just see where it's going. It could be very interesting where this one will go, where people would want to understand who got that, and it could actually delay processes based on it actually. Going a little bit further into this, the integrity and all of the compliance requirements, which is touched on by the regulations, requires each party, whether it's from the procuring party as an accounting officer or procurement officer, or even from the supplier or the bidder, to sign a code of conduct, let's say a code of good conduct in terms of complying to the requirements, to specifically also the Procurement Act, Constitution of the country, but also then goes further in very specifically require companies to and procuring parties to also actually sign up for ethical procurement. Now, this is a piece of paper that one needs to sign, and one would hope actually that it will remind everyone that what we're dealing with here and what we're dealing and what we can get to. So in terms of the due diligence and disclosure requirements, yes, obviously there must be declaration of interest. Specifically, we're sitting in areas where related parties are involved, family are involved, or even public officers are involved, for instance, and that is all part of it. For instance, bids over the amount of 5,000 rands to immediate family members or related people within within government must be published, for instance. There's no penalties, there's no action, but it must be published. So you can see there's also some civil society requirement involved in here to look for this, whether it will be published. Getting to what is the outcome, what do we need to look for, and what does this mean? Eric mentioned earlier that we focus more so here on the preference requirements, the BEE requirements. I think the one thing that we're seeing, it moves away from BEE levels. The previous system linked very specifically to your BEE level, and that provided a preference system. In this case, ownership becomes king, and very specifically 100% ownership, as it was mentioned, 100% by various parties, for instance. Partial ownership falls out of the window at the moment for that. Going further into for you as a business, for instance, pre-qualification scrutiny for these mid-sized tier 2 type of the contract. There's a requirement that at least 40% of your spend must be with 51% Black-owned entities. There's a requirement for subcontracting, for instance, and that would link back to your transformation strategy. Very shortly and very simple to simplify it, you need to look at your supply chain firstly. Obviously, we do it when you do a B scorecard. You look at, for instance, the Black ownership of entities and the likes. So one of the requirements here is 40% target on this side as well. Maybe calculated a little bit differently, interpreted maybe a little bit differently, but one can go, I don't want to go through that rabbit hole in the moment, but it actually prompts you to think around supply development, enterprise development, start to create pipelines, start to create synergies where you can deal with subcontracting and with supplier supply chains, for instance. It also counts for your large contracts where there's mandatory partnerships, for instance, that's required. At least 25% or must be subcontracted. So if you don't have these type of partnerships, these type of relationships and so on in place, it could be a very tight one and difficult one to jump around, quickly get someone to join you in this type of bidding. So compliance here, becomes a little bit more enforceable, and it's sitting with that procurement party at the end of the day, which will be overseen by the procurement office. With that, we think about the performance bonds that I mentioned. There are the debarment, there's obviously some penalties going outside. So there's quite a lot of enforcement going on that.
Thanks, Anton. I think, the question begs to be answered, where does this leave us and how does this actually now impact on BEE and the way forward? I think what's very important is that we really look at these draft regulations and that we go through it carefully and also provide public commentary by 15th of June. Bongi, just a few questions around the requirement for 100% Black ownership. Does this not wall off your broad-based ownership schemes, employee ownership schemes that were designed by the BEE Act to be empowered? And do you have any amendments that you would suggest around this?
That requirement for 100% basically exclude a whole lot of categories of individuals, especially when it comes to the sector sites. If you look at the current BEE legislation, you've got 25% Black ownership requirement on a sliding scale. It might differ from one sector code to the next, but the minimum is basically 25%, which means those kind of Black ownership won't be recognized. We get enhanced recognition when an entity is 51% Black owned, and you can get maximum points when an entity is 100% Black owned. So there's a sliding scale, and you're allowed to have, or you're encouraged to have, broad-based participation in all these structures. And again, it will include your ESOPs, your BBOS, all your trusts. But looking at the suggestion in here, it will mean all those kinds of, categories of entities, or entities are actually excluded from this process. So probably what would recommend is a harmonization of the legislation, right, to the BEE legislation in terms of those requirements. And maybe probably drop the requirement in terms of that 100% requirement and drop it to probably 51% for the set asides. And then obviously 100% maybe for micro enterprises can be the set aside. Then obviously we would want to see the inclusion of all these BBOSs, the trusts, and they can go ahead and add any safeguards in terms of verification, in terms of controls, in terms of making sure that the structures are actually genuine. But it would be good to see a harmonization of the legislation, the preferential procurement legislation with the BEE legislation at any given time.
Thanks, Bongi. Anton, with the requirement of 100% Black ownership for set asides and the 25% mandatory subcontracting for larger contracts, are we not creating a goldmine for tenderpreneurs and shell companies?
Rick, I think this is probably leading to fronting 2.0, if you think around that. There's no reference in this regulations anywhere for assistance from the BEE Commission, for instance, to assist with fronting investigations. There's no fronting investigation mechanisms being included other than just the primary type of ownership type of verification that is done, but nothing down the line, for instance. Beneficial ownership, for instance, if you think around that, and that should be disclosed anyway to the DTIC nowadays. There's just a self-declaration still required in this regulation. So if you just think around shell companies that can be registered, we've seen now lately in the news with the education books and so on, school books, The tender was issued for a couple of billion rands actually for school books. 3 days after the tender were issued, a new company, a type of publisher company, was registered, and that won the tender. The actual company who actually published the books for the past years almost, now face almost, insolvency because of that. They face closure because the tender wasn't awarded to the right person that has the capacity and the technical abilities, etc. So this is actually, it could lead to really unintended consequences, if you want to put it like that. But it could also lead to typical shelf companies being created with all of these innovative structures that we see, and it will then result obviously in subcontracting down the line. So the typical thing that we've seen we've seen this movie a few times coming along. So unfortunately, that needs to be tightened up. So cross-referencing to the B Commission should be included in this legislation. Linking to the DTIC's beneficial ownership component. Looking at the B Commission, for instance, and where they found fronting allegations in the blacklisting, they need to take this into account, for instance. There need to be a lot of these type of measures to be taken into account to counter what can happen and tenderpreneurship that can just go on in this case. And then also the poor procurement officer dealing with this. They don't necessarily have the knowledge of these complex structures. So, that procurement officer is left at their own risk to do that. And then they can actually be taken to court for that. If they're not following procedures and if they seem to delay processes. So unfortunately, they need to look at this component.
Anton, so when a particular bidder is disbarred, they automatically are disqualified from bidding. But there's also other persons that are also automatically disqualified from bidding. In which cases are people disqualified from bidding?
Yeah, so typically your public officers, for instance, cabinet ministers, MPs, and so on, councillors, your public servants, your senior public servants, and obviously by saying that anyone's family in that regard as well, also an entities that is controlled by them or even controlled by their family would also fall in this ambit as well. Typically officials of organs of state, for instance, can also be also excluded from bidding. So they need to, and the problem that we will see is how do you pick these guys, and how the link is just very, very long, actually, that you need to follow, for instance, for a family member to be linked to the actual official, for instance, and that is where a lot of problems sitting within government procurement.
Yeah, so
it's two quintiles, Eric, of linkage that is of those individuals that are excluded from procuring. So that is up until your grandfather and grandchildren, and then by affiliation your step grandfather and grandchildren and everybody in those quintiles. So that's a very, very long list of people. I don't know how they're going to keep track of it, but it's good that it's there because I think that is where a lot of the things are happening. Yeah.
I can also see linking to that is there's going to be delays on processes. If you want to really award the tender and make sure that you complied with all these requirements, you can just imagine the time it will take for a contract to be awarded to go through all of these verification processes. It's not going to be quick.
Yeah.
So the procuring institution would need to look at the debarment register, make sure that they do those cross checks. But when it comes to family, then it does become a very difficult thing to police.
Yeah.
Chris,
Will that then, Eric, be a justifiable delay? Because remember, there'll be penalties for unjustifiable delays.
Yeah, we'll have to see where that goes and how that is applied.
Yeah.
Chris, one of the criteria for pre-qualification, or in order to to be eligible for pre-qualification, you need to prove that 40% of your prior procurement was spent on 51% black-owned enterprises. With new entrants, is there not a chicken and the egg situation here with a new entrant that can't demonstrate that they meet that 40% criteria? And are there any recommendations or suggestions that we should comment on with the open commentary period?
Yeah, so your question relates to what we call in the BE world startups, effectively, or new businesses that they are effectively, kind of excluded from the pre-qualification bracket of this thing because they don't have a track record of procuring from other businesses. So I think it's the one question that comes up is, listen, is this a protection of the incumbency? In other words, is this rule made to protect those that are already doing that category of business? And then is that right or wrong? So I tend to view it this way. One can be very critical about a lot of things in the regulations, but a lot of thought did go into components of this thing. So you'll see the set-asides has got a 20 million threshold for them, and that includes natural people that can bid for these kind of contract and enterprises along with it. So it's kind of the play area of development. It's kind of the incubation phase where the idea from the regulation seems to be where black businesses get a safe space. It's not too much at risk in these contracts to gain experience and to gain a track record. And then you see coming into the pre-qualification set, pre-qualification criteria that applies to bids that I've got more risk tied to it for the fiscus, because suddenly you're dealing with contracts between 20 million and 100 million. There suddenly we're not dealing with individuals anymore. The designated groups are only small enterprises type of thing, and this requirement comes in that they must have this track record of procurement, which by implication means they must have been around for a while and have built functionality and capability operationally, financially, etc., to be able to handle a business, a contract of a couple of, in some cases it would be 25 million rand worth of subcontracting business or business that they do. So I think it's a good idea to protect the incumbency. I don't think it was deliberate necessarily to do that, but I think it is good. And then obviously when it comes to subcontracting, those rules, there's even more, but more strict rules, My suggestion around these things is actually to make it a bit more tight. So you want to limit these contracts to businesses with a proven track record, and you want to put a time frame around that. For example, a minimum 3-year contract. Now, it's going back to that point of that Anton make, that the biggest risk that we've seen in public procurement over the years under the previous dispensation is tenderpreneuring. It's these opportunistic intermediaries that then gets introduced as a layer between the people that actually do the work and the person that gets the bid, which is often just a sham or shell black-owned company. Yes, the profits flow. Yes, there's beneficiation that takes place as a result of that, but there's no value add that happens at that intermediary tier. Everything sits at the bottom, and actually all that happens is you're adding a cost to procurement, which is constitutionally counterintuitive and not allowed, because 217 says everything must be cost effective, transparent, those rules type of thing. So we want to avoid that. So put in a tier where there's almost compliance for that. Then very importantly, Section 64, which sits in Part 4 of the regulations, deals with actually Section 19 subcontracting, but Section 18, which does with pre-qualification, also has a subcontracting component to it, remember? But in context of the Section 19 one, there's a rule that says those subcontractors may not subcontract further beyond, once they get that subcontract. So I think that's a rule that should be made applicable throughout. In other words, right from the set-asides, even these individual companies, the small that plays in the and the sandpit, so to speak, where you know the incubation happens. They should not be allowed to subcontract those contracts onto other businesses. I think there should be rules around if we get our, which I agree with Bongi, we should reduce and align these requirements with the legislation. And if we see that these requirements gets reduced and you therefore have a white percentage in your shareholding, let's say the 49%, if it's 51% black, there must be rules that it can't be the bidder that owns that 49%, because that's typically what happens. The bidder creates a little shell business. It's owned by some black person that he knows, but that isn't adding value. And the legislation, the actual legislation here actually makes reference to the fact that these businesses must be black owned and managed, but it doesn't go far enough in reviewing what managed means. Because putting a person in a directorship position, which they're incapable of handling, and these kind of things is where the fronting kind of happens with these things. And then lastly, there is no look-through provision regarding subcontractors in the legislation. Nothing. In other words, even in Section 18, the pre-qualification, and then Section 19, where where subcontracting is for the bigger businesses, and even in the procurement institution does not have an obligation to go and look through this bidder to its subcontractors that he elects, to actually then look at whether they're functionally, operationally, financially capable of performing those things. There is almost a pre-requirement under subcontracting Section 19, where the procurement institution has to go and do a feasibility study to make sure whether it's feasible for this type of contract to be subcontracted, or to have subcontracting requirements in it for the bidders, and part of that is to see whether there are sufficient qualifying subcontracting bidders. But it doesn't then go further and to say once that bidder bids, to actually go, in addition to the bidder's functionality, operational, financial requirements, go and look through to the subcontractor. If we can bring those into the regulations, I think it'll go a long way to curbing tenderpreneuring and ensuring cost-efficient expenditure of the fiscus. But until that happens, I still think we have a massive amount of holes here, as far as falling short of Section 217 is concerned, and that needs to be, and that goes over and above the alignment with the BE issues and transformation, which have effectively become sidelined.
So we still expect to see opportunistic intermediaries being interplaced within the subcontracting and the bidding space.
Yeah, exactly. So just a practical example. It's as of saying in Afrikaans, 'n boer maak 'n plan. So now you've got this requirement to have subcontracted at least 40% of your business to 51%. But I can create my little startup enterprise through CIPC tomorrow. I can introduce a employee of me, or somebody that hasn't got the functionality or knows very little of anything, but has the racial credentials, or as the 100% partner in this thing, and I can go and have one invoice issued to another 51% black owned business in this thing, and Bob's your uncle. You've got a vehicle, and then there's some kind of subcontracting arrangement that takes place through this. So I mean, this is, as Anton said, we've seen this movie plenty of times within the BE space. It's just going to proliferate exponentially within this context, and it's going to hurt South Africa tremendously from an economic point of view. You're going to have businesses require capital for large infrastructure projects and stuff like that, and that capital more often than not is foreign, or if it is from here, it is blended, racially blended. So these requirements just aren't conducive to effective procurement. But it doesn't mean that the objective of developing black owned and managed businesses is wrong. It's just got to find its way, and it's got to take hands with Section 217, as the Constitutional Court case asked, that if it doesn't serve cost effectiveness, transparency and fairness, it it doesn't. But I think with these amendments that we suggest here, it could potentially actually achieve that objective if it is monitored properly. Anton, I feel for you, for what you said about the procurement official that has to look at all of this. Even if you make all these rules, you're still going to end up with a human intervention on this side. Although there are massive incentives in this thing for digital innovation within the procurement processes, and I expect with that to see AI play a big role in adjudication of these things. Hopefully, if the database system that they are projecting is going to be developed out of this thing sees a light, which it will. But if you can take the human out of the decision making as much as possible, I think those things are positive things for me that I see in the regulations and stuff. It's going to add value to the entire process.
Yeah. So there are the offences that are defined within the regulations. Bongi, just where preference is not possible, then the institution needs to file a report. So there's no penalties for where you don't apply preference. There's no consequences, no teeth around not applying preference. In Regulation 55, is it a accountability mechanism, or is it a get out of transformation free card? And do you have any suggestions around amendments?
Thank you, Eric. Yeah, it's almost sounds like an escape route out of that legislation, because at the moment you can report to the PPO or your provincial treasury. You can disclose the description, the value, and the reasons why it wasn't met, and describe the measures that have been taken, and then obviously the annual publication of the national matrix. But I think what is not being addressed is the penalties in terms of not meeting any of those stipulations and non-achievement. And what is also missing is the escalation triggers. Should that not be met, what should happen, right? Should that not be met in a number of years, 5 years or whatsoever the case, what should happen? So probably what we should recommend is, that once that happens, then there should be a mandatory PPO or intervention in that kind of a scenario. And once that annual matrix is published, maybe there should also be a scenario where that is also passed on to Parliament for remedial action or plan. And if there's continuous non-performance or individuals not meeting their requirements, let's say, for example, for a 5-year period, then that should also actually be tabled in Parliament, and probably some explanation given to the scoper. So that means then there should be a link between performance and what has been implemented within the procuring entity. Otherwise, at the moment, we see that there is a de-link between those. So something or some mechanism has to be put in place to ensure that there's penalties for non-achievement.
Yeah. Thanks, Bongi. Chris, just in closing, so we've got the B-BBEE legislation, we've got the B-BBEE Act, where if you're a level 1 company and you've got 51% black owned, you'll be excluded. Then on the other hand, we've got the Public Procurement Act that has the 100% ownership criteria requirement. How do we reconcile these two frameworks, and how does one deal with this contradiction, and are there any comments that you foresee for this commentary period?
Yeah, I can just agree with what Bongi said earlier. There has to be some kind of an alignment of these things. So maybe the question is why? Why not have a narrow-based procurement dispensation versus a broad-based procurement dispensation? I think firstly it does lip service to the entire notion of broad-based BEE, and where do we stand policy-wise as a country as far as this is concerned? Now, in the previous webinars, you would have seen that there was, we made much of it. The actual formal policy of government, still in terms of the 2003 BEE strategy, the National Development Plan reaffirmed this later. is that we should go more broad-based. Now, that's not just from a vertical scorecard point of, horizontal, in other words, broad-based ownership schemes, employee share ownership scheme, pension funds. There's a tremendous amount of transformation that happens by virtue of people holding shares within pension, not shares, but interests within pension funds that are big investors in the former listed market. So these kind of things, it's important that we recognize and stimulate broad-based BEE. If we have to have a BEE dispensation, that it is broad-based. Look at things like skills development, enterprise development, socioeconomic development, and those kind of things, rather than just narrow-based. So there is no alignment at the moment as far as these regulations are concerned. It does lip services to it in section 17 when it says you have to the minister has to have regard to the broad-based ownership rules when making these regulations. It does so once, and it does so only with reference to ownership targets, and then it quotes those ownership targets incorrectly in Schedule 1. So maybe they used AI, I don't know, and it hallucinated. But there is an alignment. It should align, Eric, to as long as we have BEE, it should be broad-based. That's my view. And I think we should encourage that and put our voices to that as far as the comments are concerned.
Yeah, so I think just to emphasize the importance of going through this draft legislation and actually providing comment by 15th of June, being very important. We've come to the end of our time. So thank you for everyone for joining, and please do contact us with any questions, or if you need support with drafting commentary, please just get in touch with us. And thank you very much for joining this morning.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
We are people-centered, pioneering, honest, accountable, dependable, responsible. We are diversifying. Partner with us to stretch thinking, push boundaries, and drive measurable, lasting change.